lifting up Jesus, opening his word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
The conflict may be in the Middle East, but the passions ignited are worldwide. Pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. But in Europe, authorities say that protests against Israel are increasingly taking on a hateful, anti-Semitic tone, with demonstrators upset by the actions of Israel taking out their anger on innocent Jewish people in Europe, ones not expressing pro-Israel views, ones just living their lives. In Paris, France, Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized, even set on fire, following a pro-Palestinian rally last week. In the UK, more than 100 anti-Semitic incidents have been reported over the last few weeks.
These type of violence directly directed against the Jewish community, against the synagogues. And that's something very new that reminds the Jewish community of the pogroms that we all heard of but never lived through.
Vandalism and fears of worse may seem not as important as war zone deaths, but anti-Semitism in Europe has a precedent, with a body count of 6 million, and a surge in recent years with thousands of Jews fleeing Europe amidst the toxic hate of extremist political parties. The situation's gotten so dire, just last week, the foreign ministers of France, Italy, and Germany, in a joint statement, denounced the hateful actions, writing, quote, "Attacks against people of Jewish belief and against synagogues cannot be tolerated in our societies in Europe. Nothing, including the dramatic military confrontation in Gaza, justifies any such transgressions in Europe." Here in the U.S., support for Israel is strong, though there have been some incidents.
Such a desecration of something that's holy.
Support of Hamas made its way to this Miami synagogue, painted alongside swastikas.
My wife is shaking. She woke up and heard this news. My wife is gathering the kids and she's shaking. She feels like this is 1940s all over again.
It is yet another troubling sign of hatred spreading beyond the bombs of war.
Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio, here live in England via Skype with James Jacob Prasch. It is January 12th, 2018, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. Welcome to This Week in Prophecy. Let's move ahead. Once again, the most important news is being underreported by the mainstream media. That is important in the sense of its biblical relevancy, but it's not being widely covered. We shall cover it as our last major feature on This Week in Prophecy. First of all, however, we're again concerned with the rising anti-Semitism and rising anti-Westernism in Europe. The Carmel restaurant, the Glad Kosher restaurant in Amsterdam, a city noted for its long history, centuries-old history of liberalism and tolerance, was attacked repeatedly by Muslims and has now been attacked in what amounted to an attempted terror attack by a Syrian refugee allowed into Europe as a refugee from Syria. We've been warning that Syrian refugees should not be permitted into Europe unless they're Christian. They should be going to Muslim countries. Nonetheless, although the man was caught and wrestled to the ground, handcuffed and arrested by Dutch police, the Netherlands authorities have refused to charge him with either attempted terror or a hate crime. Meanwhile, a Jew in Amsterdam wearing an Israeli flag, standing next to an anti-Israel protester, not breaking the law, simply wearing an Israeli flag, was detained by police, arrested without charge, essentially, and held for a week in jail, while this Muslim was released. Again, the two standards we see in Germany under Herr Merkel are now coming to Holland and other countries. We're not suggesting there is widespread anti-Semitism among the rank and file Dutch people, but we are seeing a move to the left in certain quarters in Holland as well as the incredible growth of a radical Islamic population within the Muslim population, responsible for the assassination of, among others, Theo van Gogh inside of Holland itself. Again, the hypocrisy and dual standards we see with the Dutch government. This is why we have a sympathetic spot, in part, towards Geert Wilders. He's been mischaracterized and misrepresented as a racist, as a hate candidate. He is not. He's simply telling the truth about the Islamic threat to Western Europe. He did well in the election, but not as well as we hoped he would have. Our real concern becomes this, however. What's happened under Herr Merkel in Germany spreading to other countries in Europe. For some years, we've been warning, if the mainstream political parties and governments of Europe do not stand up to Islamic immigration, where Muslims are coming to Europe who should be going as refugees to Muslim countries, many of them radicalized and without any way of screening who is militant and who is not, that it is going to result in a backlash of people going to the extreme right, even neo-Nazi parties. That has certainly begun to happen now that an ultra-nationalist German party has won 13% of the seats in Germany. That never happened before. This is very dangerous, and the blame lies squarely at the feet of Angela Merkel. Again, we've been very concerned about Germany rediscovering its neo-Nazi past, about certain court decisions, about the toleration of anti-Semitism by the German authorities and by Angela Merkel's immigration policies that are rejected by Eastern Europeans, such as Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, etc. She's a very, very dangerous woman. She's no friend of Israel. She's no friend of America. And many people in Germany feel she's no friend of Germany. Now, again, our purposes are not political. We are simply looking at the prophetic significance of the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, but it is being facilitated by the policies of the Merkel government. And it's spreading to other countries in Europe. Let us continue looking. The news in the United States this week has been dominated by the book by Michael Wolff, Fire and Fury, Castigating Donald Trump. He's making a lot of money on this book, but what seems absurd is this. In the preface of the book, he admits these stories are uncorroborated. Many of these stories cannot be corroborated, and some of the people he has interviewed are contradicting each other. He simply puts it out there for people to decide. He admits the book lacks verification and credibility. Yet the hate Trump agenda is so prolific in the mainstream media and on the American left, the book is selling like hotcakes and being treated as factual, even though in the preface the author says it cannot be verified as factual. Of course, Steve Bannon, who gave the most damaging information, has not denied it, but he has essentially apologized for it and retracted his position contrary to Mr. Trump's. Be that as it may, I think the book will have no impact on Mr. Trump's base. If he modifies his policy on immigration, it may, but I don't think that book is going to be a factor one way or another. There is now a fury in America over Mr. Trump's latest remarks concerning DACA. Nothing has been set in stone, but the position of most conservatives and his own supporting base has been, first, build the wall, secure the border before anything else can be decided. It is also clear that many DACA claimants of these 800,000 people who claim to be brought as children to the United States illegally by their parents cannot prove they were brought illegally by their parents. It's simply their say-so. Some of these people have criminal records, quite a number. In fact, would otherwise be listed as undesirables. It's creating a ruckus. Mr. Trump needs to come to terms with this. His remarks after a list of countries that were being given preferential status for coming into the United States that included Central American countries and certain African countries and Haiti, he referred to them in a manner that had a vulgar expletive. I wouldn't begin to defend his language. It was crude and it was improper for the President of the United States to engage in such language, even in private conversation. What he said, however, is what the immigrants to the United States from those countries themselves say. If those countries were not gutters, if they were not sewers, they wouldn't be coming to the United States to escape from them. He has said nothing that those people who've arrived in the United States from those countries have not by their own actions said themselves. Now, again, the left has jumped all over this. The fact of the matter remains that the United States has made it very difficult for people from developed countries to get a visa to come into the United States. People from developed countries. While other English-speaking democracies, as we've said, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all have a points system of some description, deciding whom they will allow in, who is going to benefit their own countries and economies.
These are the top 10 countries with the most foreign-born immigrants living there, and where the different groups in each country came from, according to a 2013 report by the United Nations. Number 10 is Spain. Romanians are the biggest group of foreign-born in Spain. You'd think it would be Moroccans because of its proximity to Morocco. They're basically neighbors. But Romanians in Spain became more numerous than Moroccans around 2007. Latin American immigrants are also well represented because of the appeal of still being able to speak Spanish. Spain, and every other country on this list, draws immigrants mainly because of its relatively strong economy, although Spain has taken a big hit after the global financial crisis led to the collapse of its housing market. With almost 6.5 million immigrants, Australia is number 9. There are almost 3 times as many Brits living in Australia as the next most prevalent group down under, the Chinese. In fact, out of all the countries in the world, Australia is home to the most British immigrants. Australia's foreign-born population in relation to the rest of the country is pretty large, with more than 1 in 4 of its residents coming from somewhere else. Number 8 is Canada. Even though Canada and America share one of the longest borders in the world, there are only 317,000 Americans living north of its northern border. But Canada is home to the biggest Hong Kong community outside of Hong Kong, and to reciprocate, Hong Kong is home to the most Canadians of any city in Asia. France and its 7.4 million immigrants is number 7 on this list. Its largest immigrant group is from Algeria, which also is its only foreign-born population larger than 1 million people. Algeria was a colony of France for more than a century until it declared independence in 1962, so the ties between the two countries remain deep. Number 6 is the United Kingdom. As an island nation, it's easier for the United Kingdom to regulate immigration. Just like France, the UK's biggest source of immigrants is a former colony, in this case, India, whom Britain ruled until 1947. After Poland joined the European Union in 2004, the number of Poles coming to the United Kingdom increased sharply. The UK is now home to more Polish immigrants than any other country in the world. With 7.8 million immigrants, the United Arab Emirates is number 5 on this list. A staggering 83.7% of the people living in the UAE were born in another country. That's by far the highest rate in the world. Indian, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani workers arrive by the hundreds of thousands each year to help build the UAE, as places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi experience a construction boom unlike any the world has ever seen. 4th is Saudi Arabia's 9 million foreign-born people. Saudi Arabia is right up there with Russia as the world's biggest exporter of oil, which drives its entire economy and attracts millions of immigrants. The vast majority of migrant workers come from the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and Africa, and are employed in the agriculture, cleaning, and domestic service industries. With nearly 10 million immigrants, Germany is number 3 on this list. Turks are the largest immigrant group in Germany, a trend that began on a wide scale during a labor shortage in the 1960s and 1970s in West Germany, which the government solved by striking a labor deal with the government of Turkey. The more than 1 million Polish immigrants in Germany makes sense because the two countries are neighbors, and after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, So does the more than 1 million Russians who were attracted to Germany, like the Poles, because of the strong German economy. Number 2 is Russia, with more than 11 million immigrants. All 10 of Russia's largest immigrant groups came from countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. They come because Russia's economy is stronger than their own, but they're pretty much the only ones arriving. The number of people leaving Russia in 2013 stood at 186,000. That's more than 5 times as many left the country just 3 years earlier, in 2010. And number 1 is the United States of America, with more than 45 million foreign-born residents. 1 in every 5 people in the whole world living outside of their country of birth live in the United States. That's a big deal, and is the single biggest reason why the Americans lead the world both economically and culturally. The nearly 13 million Mexicans living in the United States make up the single largest group of immigrants anywhere in the world. Today, Asians, which includes and is driven by Chinese and Indians, are the largest immigrant group coming to America. Thanks for watching.
The United States does not. They have chain policies that if you have relatives here, even if the relatives may have entered illegally, you should be allowed to come. The United States has made it increasingly difficult for Asian immigrants, people from India, people from Southeast Asia, people from Korea, Taiwan, people who are culturally renowned for their math skills, the skills in mathematics and computer sciences. People that the United States can benefit from in terms of their contribution to the economic competitiveness of American industry in the high-tech fields. We are turning people like that away, even though they've done master's degrees and PhDs in the United States and American universities such as Caltech or Stanford or MIT, making it difficult for them, in many cases, denying them visas, turning them away in order to bring in people who have been members or are members of M13, in order to bring in people illegally from Central South America and other countries to take jobs away from Hispanic Americans and to take jobs away from Afro-Americans. Repeatedly, we've said the main responsibility of the American government is to its own poor, its own minorities. Hispanic Americans, Afro-Americans need to come before people without a legal right to be in the country. No, we do not appreciate or think it was wise to express these truths and realities the way Mr. Trump did. The vulgarity was out of place. Now, what does this have to do with prophecy? Daniel tells us once more, there will be a conflict between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Hispanics. The first Hispanics in the United States came from Spain. Spain has an unemployment rate of 25%. There are people in Spain who would love to immigrate to the United States, many of them young professional people looking for economic prospects not available in Spain any longer. Why is it so hard for them as Hispanics? Why should they be relegated to a status that makes it very difficult to enter the United States and get a visa, while people from South America should be allowed to stay here simply by breaking the law and taking jobs away from Hispanic and Black Americans? This is what the reality is. We have an absurd situation. Ponce de Leon came to Florida in 1513, established the oldest city in the United States, St. Augustine, Florida. Texas, California, the Southwest were effectively colonized by conquistadors from Spain, De Soto, Coronado. There is nothing more American than a Hispanic. The Spaniards came before the Mayflower did. The Spaniards came before Jamestown. And in the Southwest, they intermarried with Native Americans, call them Indian tribes if you will. So you've got the first Europeans who came intermarrying with the indigenous American peoples. Nothing can be more American than a Hispanic. Why have they been reduced to a minority status? They should not be part of the minority. They should be part of the American establishment, as anybody should be, but it has been socially engineered for political purposes by vested interests in both parties, particularly the Democrats. What a mess. Mr. Trump is correct. We need more people coming from Europe. We certainly need more people coming from Asia. And there are other countries in Latin America that are not Mexican or Central American. What about people from Argentina and Chile who want to come to the United States? Aren't they Latin American? Aren't the people from Spain Hispanic? This is a discrimination against American Hispanics and against Hispanics of non-Central American countries. But the mainstream media will not tell the truth. Demographically, politically, or economically, they have their own agenda. Again, this relates to the book of Daniel, trying to make them combine in the seeds of men, trying to force a version of multiculturalism that is never going to work. Now, we see this certainly happening in the European Union, but we see it crossing the Atlantic to the New World and happening in the United States and Canada. This week in Prophecy, it all relates to the book of Daniel, even though the United States is not specifically mentioned in Prophecy. The United States is the cultural and anthropological daughter of Britain and Europe. That's the reality. Now, some people have interpreted passages such as the young lions being the nations that came out of the British Empire. That's speculative. I don't know. But I do know the languages of North and South America are English, Spanish, Portuguese, French. I know where we came from. Even African Americans were bought by the British from British colonies in Africa and from French colonies in Africa. We cannot separate the history of the United States from Europe. The immigration issues facing Europe are part and parcel of the immigration issues facing the United States. Every political commentator knows that the Trump election victory in America has its parallel in the Brexit victory in Great Britain. But the way the media spins and lies, there's no end to it. Nigel Farage was asked on a TV program that was a phone-in by a Muslim named Ahmed the following question. You speak about, and the mainstream media is speaking about Russian collusion in the American election. Now they're speaking about it in Brexit or in British elections. Why do you not say anything, or why does nobody say anything about the Jewish lobby in America? This was a Muslim asking him this. Mr. Farage replied as follows. Now, Mr. Farage is an open denunciator of anti-Semitism. He said the following. There are only 6 million Jews in the United States, but they are well organized and they do have a lobby. They may have a disproportionate amount of influence, but other groups have such lobbies like the Hindus. The idea, however, that the Israeli government in any way was able to control the outcome of the American elections is ridiculous and absurd. That's what he said. There was nothing anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish in his statement. But the left-wing press jumped all over it and said he's talking about Jews controlling America, things he never said or even implied. Well, now they're doing the same thing with Mr. Trump's comments on certain countries in the Caribbean, Africa, and Central America. An Egyptian spokesman, Captain Ashraf al-Khalidi, phoned multiple media outlets and television stations in Egypt, urging Palestinian Arabs to accept Ramallah, not Jerusalem, as the capital of a future Palestinian state. He said that although officially the Egyptian government had to, for political reasons, take issue with, in a form of moderated protest, the Israeli government's establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, as an undivided capital, and raise a voice of protest at the policies of the Trump administration in this regard, he said, in actual substance, it's not the problem people have made it to be. There is no reason the Palestinians should demand Jerusalem as a political capital of a Palestinian state. There's no reason it shouldn't be Ramallah. Hence we see something everybody knows. What governments friendly to the United States and Israel say in public is not always what they really believe in private. He speaks the truth. He spoke the truth this week in Prophecy. This week in Prophecy, left-wing American Jewish groups have begun protesting or objecting to the Israeli decision to deport 38,000 African illegal immigrants. Unfortunately, the Barnabas Fund, that has generally been a good organization that has done in the past good work, has tried to make this a crusade and a cause. In fact, these Africans who've come to Israel and entered illegally did not come as fleeing persecution. They came from Eritrea, they came from South Sudan, they came from the Horn of Africa, not because of anti-Christian persecution. They're not proper refugees, and there certainly were not Christians being persecuted for their faith. They came as economically motivated migrants. Economically motivated migrants. Now, this mess in the South Sudan, this horrible, horrible refugee crisis, with now refugees spilling over into Uganda and neighboring countries, is indeed horrific. Starvation is being used by both sides. Engineered starvation is being used by both sides as a weapon against civilian populations. What is the real disgrace of this? After 3.4 million Christians were murdered by Muslims in Sudan, now a supposed Christian South Sudan are doing it to each other along tribal lines. This is not Israel's fault or Israel's problem, and Israel should not have to absorb refugees from these places. Israel did take Christian refugees who were persecuted and threatened, whose existence was put into a precarious position in southern Lebanon. Israel took the phalangists. They took Christian refugees, gave them a home and protection from Hezbollah. But these people from Sudan and from the Horn of Africa have come to Israel with economic motives. 38,000 are about to be deported. Israel is giving them money and airline tickets, up to $3,500 a person. I think it's far too generous. I think they should just be given $1,000 or something and sent back where they came from. They did not come escaping religious persecution in any primary sense. They had South Sudan to go to, which was a Christian country. They had places in Africa to go to. They were not like the Christians in Iraq or South Lebanon. They had a place to go to. We see even evangelical organizations like Barnabas Fund trying to make it a human rights issue and a Christian rights issue when it has nothing to do with Christian rights. Given the birth rate of these illegal immigrants from the Horn of Africa into Israel, over the next 5 years, they will have 50,000 children born in Israel. 50,000 is a huge amount of people for a country the size of Israel. Illegal immigrants, as soon as their standard of living improves, they have more children and larger families. 50,000. What are the Israeli government supposed to do with them in a Jewish state? they should not be coming to Israel. They should be going to African countries or staying home. Had they been persecuted for their faith, the issue would be different. Had they been even legitimate refugees, it would be different. But they're simply economically motivated illegal immigrants. That is most of them. That's how they need to be seen. Now even Barnabas Fund is not telling the truth. But let's move on. The leader of Hamas, according to the spokesman, Farzi Bahum, the leader of Hamas, Imad al-Alami, according to Hamas spokesman Farzi Bahum, shot himself in the head in an accident. He was taken to Shifa Hospital in Gaza, where he is listed as in critical condition. Quite a situation. Imad al-Alami is the Hamas leader who is the primary liaison with terrorist sponsoring Iran and the Gaza Strip. He is their link man. He had been the representative of Hamas in Iran, in Tehran, but now he is the linchpin between relations between Iran and Hamas on the Gaza Strip. He was involved in multiple terrorist attacks. At one time, had been captured by the Israelis, but unfortunately released. And now he finds himself in a hospital bed that he put himself in by shooting himself in the head. This may very well be the hand of God, bringing judgment upon him by his own hand. Meantime, in the United States and Washington, D.C. conference, this week in prophecy, the Middle East Studies Association proves itself to be a misnomer. In its revisionist policies that it's had since Edward Said took control of it in the 1980s, it has rather been a political activist association for a combination of left-wing and Islamic anti-Israel activism. They've carried on their usual diatribes against Israel, virtually rewriting history, telling one lie after another. But they didn't mention the word scholar, and they had no scholars speaking at it. Why should any university accredit something that is nothing more than an activist organization as an academic organization, which it most certainly is not? It has no scholars. It only has activists. This week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, we've had more shenanigans from London by London's former mayor, the New York-born Boris Johnson, a conservative supposedly, and the present Muslim mayor of London. Boris Johnson unfortunately said that Israel will have to share Jerusalem in the future with the Palestinian Muslim Arabs as the capital. Who is he to dictate what Israel has to do? We have to remember that after the Second World War, the British Empire declined. Great Britain has had power and influence in the world, residually because of its Commonwealth and what it once was, but essentially because it is the junior partner in the strategic special relationship with the United States. That is why Britain has had power and influence since the end of the Second World War, because of its partnership with the United States. Britannia no longer rules the waves and can no longer make those kinds of dictates with any authority.
The recognition by Donald Trump of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel will do grave damage to the prospects for a just and lasting peace settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which has been British and indeed American foreign policy for decades. Was she consulted about this announcement, and if so, what did she say? And will she here and now unequivocally and clearly condemn it?
Well, I say to the right honourable gentleman that I'm intending to speak to President Trump about this matter, but our position has not changed. Our position, as he says, has been a long-standing one, and it's also a very clear one, that the status of Jerusalem should be determined as in a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Jerusalem should ultimately form a shared capital between the Israeli and Palestinian states. That is, we continue to support a two-state solution. We recognise the importance of
the United States that does command that kind of leverage. Mr. Trump said the status of Jerusalem will be determined by Israel, not dictated by America or by any outside forces or voices. Boris Johnson, living in an empire that no longer exists, said the opposite. Now, I'm an Anglophile. I love Britain. My family were from Britain. I am loyal to Britain. I desire nothing but good for Britain. But nothing but bad will come to Britain if it curses Israel and continues to placate the voices of Islamic radicalism and the radicalized Palestinian nationalism. Boris Johnson did a tremendous disservice to Britain as foreign minister and as former mayor of London. The present mayor of London has been making much capital, however, out of President Trump's decision to cancel tentative plans to visit the UK and visit London, saying that Trump got the message that the people of London don't want him. Now understand what this man is. You've had not only in Manchester attacks on pop concerts, but in London, radical Muslim terrorists knifing people in front of the Parliament. Radical Muslim terrorists driving on the sidewalk on London Bridge, running British citizens over and killing them. Radical Muslims putting bombs on tube trains and on double-deck buses and blowing them to pieces. And all the mayor of London, himself a Muslim, says is, after a British soldier was hacked to death by two Muslims in Greenwich, England, what he says after all of these terrorist attacks? We need to get used to it as a way of life. The Muslim mayor says the people of Britain need to get used to Islamic terror as a way of life. This is the mayor of London. This is God's judgment. I do not want to see God's judgment coming on Great Britain. A mayor like that, he should not be allowed to be mayor. He should probably not even be allowed in the country if he has those sentiments. Just because Islamic terror is commonplace in the Muslim world, now it should be commonplace on the streets of Britain, says the mayor of London. Saadi Din Ibrahim, an Egyptian academic of some stature, together with Rami Aziz, another Egyptian scholar who's quite well established internationally on the lecture circuit, spoke recently at Tel Aviv University. And they were heckled by Arab students. Now, first of all, find me a university anywhere in the Muslim world that will allow Jewish students to even attend and be students, let alone heckle speakers. But Israel allows Arabs with public funding, subsidizing their studies, to attend Israeli universities. And they heckle two fellow Arab speakers because the Arabs speak about the amount of tolerance that exists in Israel. They're called traitors and betrayers of the Arab people, of the Muslim people, of the Palestinian people, when all they did was tell the truth. That is what radical Islam cannot handle. The truth and those who tell it, even if it's told by other Muslims. To his credit, Mr. Trump has begun to slash the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which supposedly exists to provide economic support for community development among Palestinian Arabs on the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, of course, continues to support and finance terror and those who are supportive of terror. Mr. Trump has frozen $125 million in payments and said it may go up to $180 million. We believe that all aid to the Palestinian Authority should stop immediately, but Mr. Trump has made a good beginning. 9 Christians were killed in Helwan, Egypt, a place I've been to many times, on the 29th of December. 9 murdered. In China, 2 churches were demolished in Shaanxi province.
Few places in the world are seeing the explosion of God's power like the underground church in China is experiencing. And in the last 60 years, China's communist government has done its best to wipe Christianity off the map. What you are about to see is some of the rarest footage on the planet. In this church, the people wake up at 4:30 to come together for 2 hours to pray and worship. They do this every day. This church meets in the only place they're safe, a cave. This church meets on a farm, far away from prying eyes. Here's an example of an underground church outreach. The people sitting are Christians. The people who are standing are not. This particular preacher was once crippled, but was healed when someone prayed for her. She now preaches the good news of Jesus to anyone who will listen. In this particular meeting, over 1,000 people became Christians. Here, Christians cast out demons from an 18-year-old girl. She's now a preacher. In Shanghai alone, there are over 3,000 house churches, just like this one. One thing Dennis pointed out to me was that most of the underground churches in China are actually led by young people. These kids have all come out of the communist system, and they want nothing to do with it. They only want to spread the love of Jesus to everybody they meet. This is a music school. Well, that's the cover anyway. It's really a training school for students who want to be pastors. The government thinks they're simply learning to play instruments. One thing I quickly realized about the Chinese church is that it's a lot different from the American one. For one thing, they think a 4-hour sermon is short. In this church service, it's 120 degrees inside the building. The people meet for 12 hours straight. Dennis told me one story about a time he went to a very remote village in China to preach. He was led into a large room where the people were packed so closely together that he had his back to the wall and could reach out and touch the row in front of him. Everyone stood. There was no room to sit. He asked how long he should preach for, and they told him from 8:30 to 7 at night. Then they asked him if it wasn't too much trouble, could you come back tomorrow and preach from 8:30 to 7 again? And then, very sheepishly, they asked again, if you'd be so kind, could you come back the day after that and preach from 8:30 to 7? He asked how often he should take breaks, and they told him not to stop. The people will wait. Then he asked them what he should preach on. Everything, they replied, from Genesis to Revelation. And then it dawned on him, these people had no Bibles.
After the death of Mao Zedong, the Chinese people, cheated by a false god, began to search for the true God. For the first time in their lives, people from the lowest levels of society came face to face with God's unconditional love, with Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and with the knowledge that in God's temple they had value and dignity. How could they not rejoice, like everyone who has received the most precious gift in the world?
The first time I went to church, I felt the atmosphere there was really good. I found true meaning in life. I found a peace that I never felt before. Peace in the Lord. So I can say without reservation, I will follow God for the rest of my life.
After the service, my soul felt especially sweet and joyful. Lord, how wonderful it will be if we can meet like this every day.
I lay awake for 3 nights, overwhelmed with joy. I thought, Lord, what have I received? Why am I so filled with joy? I have no money. I have no family. I have nothing. And you know, I was absolutely sure that this joy came from heaven.
Since the ascent of power in 2013 by Xi Jinping, persecution of Christians has intensified in China. It has gotten worse, seriously worse, in the last 4 to 5 years under its present leader. He's a wicked man and an enemy of Christ in the character and spirit of Mao. We need to pray that the Lord removes him. This may prevent me from getting back into China. Nonetheless, I stand by my words. He's the devil's man, and we need to pray against him. In the Niger Delta, not northern Niger, in the Niger Delta, not northern Nigeria, where the Muslims regularly persecute Christians and have done for more than 25 years, but in southern Nigeria now, cult followings, for some reason extremely anti-Christian. At a New Year's Eve service, 14 Christians were murdered in the Nile Delta. Something terrible is happening in Nigeria, not only in the north, but in the more traditionally Christian south. We had the murder of a British medical missionary several weeks ago in the same region. I don't know what's happening in Nigeria, but no government seems to be able to stop the corruption, the murder, the radical Islam, or now the cult killings in the Delta. It is a serious, serious mess.
It's the launch of a joint report by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the European Union and the National Bureau of Statistics x-rayed the level of corruption in Nigeria between 2012 to 2017. In attendance are government officials and members of international organizations. The report indicates that over 400 billion naira is paid in cash to public officials as bribes annually, which is equivalent to 39% of the budget allocation for education in 2016. The United Nations country representative expresses concern over the report's findings.
There is a need to also investigate and prosecute the corrupt offenses, and in that context also to have mechanisms of international cooperation so that if offenders go to other countries and try to deposit the stolen money overseas, that there is cooperation between the countries to bring these offenders back and also to recover the stolen assets.
But how well has the government been tackling corruption?
This government has done very well, and our achievement is unprecedented. You can see the amount of recoveries from looters. Last week we got almost $437 million US from one of the looters.
International organizations provide insight on how to fight corruption.
We are going to continue working with the bodies that try to fight against corruption. We are going to continue supporting the Ministry of Justice to try to maintain respect for the rule of law and even improve the respect for the rule of law in this country. So this will be a program of 25 million euros, which will run for the next 4 years.
Experts from this meeting insist that more synergy between government agencies and international partners is crucial in ensuring that the detrimental effect of corruption is curbed so that Nigeria and its citizens can fully prosper.
The Senate Committee on Tertiary Institutions is appealing to the Academic Staff Union of Universities, ASU, to reconsider its position, shelve the strike, and return to the negotiation table. The chairman of the committee, Senator Jibrin Barrow, regrets that ASU embarked on the strike without engaging the Senate first to seek for a resolution of the matter.
Given the number of evangelical Christians in Nigeria, one can surmise there's a spiritual battle for the nation's future. But it's difficult to fathom how, with so many Christians, this can be allowed to continue the way it is. Admittedly, many of the Christian leaders have preached false messages, such as the late Benson Idahosa, who became involved in money preaching, or T.B. Joshua, who was essentially a witch doctor masquerading as a Christian, who was essentially a witch doctor who masquerades as a Christian preacher and what he teaches and does. I'm not saying it is all solid evangelicism, but the Anglican Archbishop of Lagos, for instance, has stood up on moral issues against the Church of England establishment in Canterbury and at Lambeth Palace in England. There have been quite a number of very good Nigerian evangelists and pastors. We need to pray for the church in Nigeria. But this week in prophecy, the killings have become worse. They took place in the Kirisani and Obu regions. So in addition to the ongoing struggles in the north with Boko Haram, now we have these other problems, these cults in the delta of the south. Desperate need for prayer. Also in Nigeria this week, a 17-year-old Christian young lady, Linda Menayi, was abducted while attending a cousin's Christian wedding. Her father was summoned to a Sharia Islamic court. Neither her father nor Linda nor her father's lawyer were even allowed to speak in the Islamic court. They were simply informed that the young woman was now married to a Muslim and that had been her desire, which it certainly was not. She was abducted. This is what goes on every day in Nigeria against Christians. Reverting again to the Middle East, in Egypt, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi attended Christian church services over the Christmas New Year holy days. And he told Christian worshipers, mostly Coptics, you are our brothers.
اسمعوني عايز اقول لكم حاجه بس. افتتاح الكاتدرائيه النهارده ده رساله كبيره قوي من مصر، مش بس للمصريين، لا ولا حتى للمنطقه، ده للعالم كله. رساله سلام ورساله محبه. احنا بفضل الله سبحانه وتعالى بنقدم نموذج للمحبة والسلام بيننا وبين بعضنا. هتخرج المحبة وهتخرج السلام من مصر وهيعم العالم كله. صدقوني أنا يمكن انتم وانتوا عايشين الأحداث اللي احنا فيها دي تقولوا معقول هيبقى في كده؟ طبعا هيبقى في كده. طب ليه هيبقى في كده؟ دايما بكرر وبقول عمر الشر وعمر الخراب وعمر التدمير وعمر القتل لا يمكن يقدر أبدا يهزم الخير والبناء والمحبة والسلام. لا يمكن. يمكن تقولوا يعني ازاي، يعني تقولوا ازاي ده هيحصل. عايز اقول لكم انا عايز اقول للناس كلها اللي بتتفرج علينا دلوقتي، يا ترى المحبة، يا ترى الفرحة دي، الفرحة اللي احنا شايفينها في الناس اللي موجودة هنا والناس اللي بتتفرج علينا تساوي كام؟ تساوي ايه؟ ليه احنا مش شايفين الخير والسعادة بيننا وبين بعضنا؟ ليه احنا مش شايفين غير الأذى؟ انا مش بتكلم على حد بعينه، انا بتكلم ان اللي انا بقوله ده واللي انتوا شايفينه ده بكرة بفضل الله سبحانه وتعالى. واحنا كمان والله بنحبكم. خلي بالكم انتم اهلنا وانتم مننا واحنا واحد، ومحدش ابدا هيقدر يقسمنا. محدش يقدر يقسمنا ابدا. انا مش عايز اطول عليكم ولا على قداسة البابا عشان تبدأوا صلواتكم، وانا سعيد ان احنا موجودين هنا وموجودين وانتوا فرحانين كده، ويا رب يقدرنا ان احنا ندخل الفرحة على كل الناس في مصر، كل الناس بدون تمييز، كل الناس. طبعا انا بشكركم على حفاوة الاستقبال، وتحيا مصر بيكم، تحيا مصر بالمصريين، تحيا مصر بالمصريين. وبقول لكم تاني، محدش ابدا هيقدر على مصر طول ما مصر كده. اوعوا تنسوا دي. اللي عايز يأذينا بيفرق بينا، اللي عايز يأذينا يفرق بينا ويخلينا ان احنا ناكل بعضنا البعض. ده مش هيحصل. كل سنة وانتم طيبين، وعام سعيد عليكم وعلينا وعلى الدنيا كلها. وكل سنة وانتم طيب يا قداسة البابا، وكل سنة وانتم طيبين، كل سنة وانتم طيبين.
In the Old Testament, as well as in the book of Acts, we see numerous instances where God has used non-believing political rulers for his purposes to the advantage of his people. We see this in the book of Daniel, we see it in the book of Acts. This is why we're told in the New Testament to pray for those who are in authority. I don't believe Mr. Trump is a born-again Christian. I think Mr. Pence is. But pray for him. General Assisi is a nominal Muslim. Pray for him. Why do we pray for such people? That we may live peaceable lives. If these people are not influenced by our prayers, they'll be influenced by something far worse. May God bless and protect General, that is President Assisi in Egypt. He's doing what needs to be done to the protection of Christians in a land where there's also a spiritual battle. You've got close to a 10% Christian population, perhaps 9% nominal Christians, Copts. But some of those Copts are born again, and there are also smaller numbers of evangelicals up against the Muslim Brotherhood, who are inextricably tied to Hamas, who are responsible for the assassination, for the murder of Anwar Sadat. When we read Isaiah 19, we see that God indeed has a prophetic purpose for Egypt and its land and its inhabitants. That will come to fruition in God's time. But in the meantime, there is a battle. We need to pray for the protection of the Christians in Egypt. The murders in Helwan were absolutely brutal. Thank God, President Assisi is at least civilized. Let's move on. The big and major news this week. The Trump administration has flip-flopped in its policy in Syria and Iraq. Coming to its senses, it does not want to repeat the mistakes incompetently perpetrated by the Obama administration. Obama left a vacuum in northern Iraq that was quickly filled by ISIS that the United States had to come and remove due to the incompetence of Obama, who then opened the door for Iranian incursions through northern Iraq into Syria in support of the Assad regime after Mr. Obama broke his word on the red line for the use of chemical weapons against Christians. They knew he was weak, they knew he couldn't be taken seriously, and they absolutely took advantage. Mr. Trump has all but destroyed ISIS, as he said he would, But now he does not want to repeat the vacuum mistake made by his predecessor, Mr. Obama. Mr. Trump has said American bases will remain indefinitely, both in northern Iraq and in eastern Syria, in order to block the designs of Russia and of Iran. Now, we have not fully agreed with Mr. Trump's policies in this area. We believed that there should have been greater support, whether Turkey likes it or not, for the Kurdish population and Kurdish militias. We continue to believe that the Kurds are the only people in northern Iraq whom the West can trust to any degree. Again, we're not saying we're in full agreement with the policies of Mr. Trump, but he at least realizes the problem, the vacuum. He's trying not to repeat the error that Mr. Obama did when he opened the door for ISIS, who filled the vacuum. Once it filled the vacuum, Mr. Obama, of course, dismissed it as a JV team. 48 hours later, it was setting off major bombs in Europe, and then after that in San Bernardino, California, and attacks in Orlando, Florida. This was Mr. Obama's JV team. Mr. Trump shows he has competence and sense. He's not going to repeat the errors of Barack Obama, if they were indeed errors and not betrayals. It's a fair question itself. The U.S. bases are there and will continue to operate because of the Russian-Iranian threat. This is important to note. In light of Daniel 10, in light of any future possible Gog and Magog scenarios, it's something we cannot overlook and should not overlook. Something else has happened this week in prophecy. There were attacks on Russian bases by drones flown from Turkish-controlled areas that were launched by anti-Assad rebels attacking Russian targets. Russia is paying an increased price for its presence in Syria and in its backing of Mr. Assad. They've lost 7 aircraft by most reports in recent attacks only 2 weeks ago, as we reported last week in prophecy. But this week in prophecy, drone attacks. Now, these are fairly advanced technologies in the hands of Syrian rebels directed against Russian targets flown from a Turkish-controlled area. It has led Moscow, Mr. Putin, to protest to the Turkish government. Now, that would seem to be a setback for any Gog-Magog type rapprochement or alliance or configuration of Turkey, Iran, and Russia in any kind of league for the time being, amplifying out of proportion anything that could resemble a Gog and Magog scenario. We have to take into account those factors that may mitigate against it, and this is one of them. These drone attacks were launched from a Syrian-controlled area, and Mr. Putin is not happy. Meanwhile, the IDF, the Israeli military, has shot 2 radical Islamic rioters at Gaza and near Nablus, Arak Berka. They've also arrested several radical Muslims outside the tomb of the patriarchs, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are traditionally buried in Hebron, where they confiscated assault knives. The Israelis have shown tremendous restraint in dealing with Palestinian Arab Muslim rioters. I think it has been a misplaced restraint. When you're dealing with these kinds of rioters who aim to kill if they can, you have to take preventative action, even if it means killing them before they kill you. Nobody likes bloodshed. Nobody likes to advocate killing. But the New Testament does not teach against self-defense. That is not the meaning of turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek means we do not return evil for evil. It does not mean we don't protect ourselves, our families, our nations, etc. This week, in prophecy, in Gaza, in Nablus, and in Hebron, the land of the Bible, where the patriarchs sleep. It is anticipated that there will be new U.S. sanctions as the nuclear deal with Iran review is about to come into This Week in Prophecy. U.S. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin said that it is likely there will be new U.S. sanctions against Iran as the nuclear deadline approaches for review once again. Iran has been consistently non-compliant in these things. The Bush administration, has been consistently non-compliant in these things that the Obama administration handed them on a silver platter. Mr. Bush has taken a harder line. Let's hope and pray he continues to do so and that the sanctions are put in force. But it was announced by the Treasury Secretary that is what is likely going to happen as the nuclear deal is now once again up for review, and the terms of operation until now are due to expire again, subject to review. There will likely be new sanctions this week in prophecy. Also, finally this week in prophecy, the Israeli government has begun to schedule out its budget for the forthcoming year. And it is making greater defense expenditure allowances for the defense of northern Israel and Galilee, from attacks from Lebanon, but more importantly in the Golan Heights from Syria, in response to what is transpiring inside Syria, including the Iranian threat. This is going to put more economic strain on Israel as it needs to mobilize greater defense provisions along the Golan Heights and the Lebanese border. Nonetheless, there doesn't seem to be any lack of national resolve, nor any lack of consensus that there is simply no choice but to do what needs to be done. So hence we see both Israel and the United States accepting the strategic realities of what is taking place in Syria this week in prophecy. My name is Jacob Prasch. Please continue to keep the president in prayer. That is President Trump. Please continue to pray for the IDF and for the American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, that God will protect them as they withstand radical Islamic invasion. Please pray for the salvation of Muslims and of Jews in the Middle East. And please pray that the tide of radical Islam that is scourging Europe will be addressed effectively, and that those who pander to it, and that those who even align with it against Israel and the Jewish population of Europe will be dealt with by the hand of the Almighty. God bless, and thank you so much for listening. Hopefully we'll be speaking to you next week, this week in prophecy. My name is Jacob Prasch. Thank you.